This is the Mop-Up. I'm David Feldman. Senator Tim Kaine, the Democrat from Virginia, about to introduce legislation mandating that Donald Trump cannot assist Israel in its war on Iran without congressional approval first. Donald Trump just left the G7 meeting early. French President Emmanuel Macron saying Trump rushed home to negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. But Trump immediately trashed Macron, saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. Trump calling Macron publicity hungry. He says that I'm not rushing back for a ceasefire. Trump saying I'm rushing back for something much bigger than a ceasefire. I don't know what he's planning. I do know Trump's war cabinet thinks the missile attacks against the Houthis in Yemen were a huge success back in March. They weren't. The Houthis are still launching missiles into Israel. And although Trump won't admit it, he has some neocons advising him. Neocons who have been saying since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003 that real men invade Iran. That's what they used to say after we went into Iraq. Real men invade Iran. There is a very strong contingent in Washington pushing for regime change in Iran right now because it looks easy. But war always looks easy when it starts. Donald Trump urging everyone living in Tehran to evacuate as Israel intensifies its aerial assault. Israel claiming complete control over the skies of Iran. 70 Iranian women and children have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, brings a total of 220 dead as we enter day 5 of Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear ambitions. It is now estimated that 20 Israelis have been killed by Iranian missile attacks. Donald Trump flew home, as I said earlier, from the G7 meeting in Alberta. He's claiming something big is about to happen. He won't say what it was, but he added it's not a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. Trump, before leaving Alberta, signed a joint statement along with the other leaders of the G7 condemning Iran's nuclear ambitions. Al Jazeera reporting that at least 56 Palestinians were killed yesterday, mostly in southern Gaza, while they were lining up for humanitarian aid. Volker Turk, the United Nations human rights chief, condemning the attack. Israel is attacking Iran as we begin, and Iran is attacking Israel. It is estimated that only 10 missiles were fired at Israel by Iran last night. Some military analysts suggesting Iran could be running out of ballistic missiles. I'll have more on all this later on in the program. This is the Mop-Up. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you so much for joining me. Flash floods in San Antonio, Texas, killed as many as 13 people over the weekend. Flash floods killed as many as 6 in West Virginia. And for the first time ever, Alaska is now under a heat advisory. So obviously, the biggest problem facing our country isn't Exxon setting fire to our planet. It's the migrants pouring into our country at a record all-time low. It is at an all-time low. They're not coming in. But we can't address climate change. Not only are Republicans ignoring climate change, but their new budget eliminates practically all the green energy subsidies passed in Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of those green energy subsidies have already, in the past 2 years, created close to 1 million good-paying jobs in red states. But in America, oil companies come first. New reporting from the Texas Tribune that Texas's crackdown on migrants, dubbed Operation Lone Star, has doubled the number of migrants found dead along the Mexico-El Paso border. The Texas Tribune reporting a significant increase in the remains of bodies found along El Paso's 84-mile border with Mexico during the past 3 years as migrants, thanks to Operation Lone Star, are now forced to take riskier routes in order to make it into our country. The Texas Tribune reporting that after El Paso agreed to participate in Governor Greg Abbott's Operation Lone Star, that was in December of 2022, the number of human remains found along the El Paso border, the number of human remains found along the El Paso border has doubled over a 1-year period. The Texas Tribune reporting that because these migrants are forced to enter the country through the remotest areas near the border, it often takes months before their remains are discovered. New reporting that ICE is now $1 billion over budget for 2025 and might run out of money next month. This explains reports of even more horrible conditions for the nearly 51,000 immigrants held inside ICE's network of for-profit detention centers. While ICE holds 51,000 migrants, their for-profit detention centers right now only have the capacity to hold 38,000. This makes the network of for-profit ICE detention facilities nearly 35% overcrowded right now. That's in direct violation of our Constitution's 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Throughout the country, families of those being held are reporting shortages of basic necessities like beds to sleep on, soap, showers, clean drinking water, and food. Some attorneys now reporting 1 meal a day. Many inside these for-profit facilities are providing 1 meal a day for children as well as diabetics. This all came to a head at Delaney Hall, the Newark, New Jersey for-profit ICE detention facility run by GEO Group, one of the largest contributors to Donald Trump's 2024 campaign. GEO Group paid $60 million a year. GEO Group has paid $60 million a year to run that Newark detention facility. The Trump administration just agreed to pay GEO Group $1 billion to convert that one building in Newark into a larger detention center. That's for $1 billion. So it's all about the bottom line. Get as much money from the federal government and increase profits by cutting back on living conditions for the detainees. The CEO of GEO Group is J. David Donahue. His phone number is 561-893-0101. I called 561-893-0101. It took about 4 minutes until somebody answered, and all I got was an answering machine. One would think a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded corporation like GEO Group would have a working phone number. But if you call 561-893-0101 and politely register your complaint, you have to wait about 3 minutes, 4 minutes, but they will answer, asked to speak to the CEO of GEO Group, J. David Donahue. Last week, the Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal from GEO Group. GEO Group is trying to block a class action suit filed by former inmates accusing the for-profit detention company of forcing detainees to work for $1 a day. Otherwise, they would be placed in solitary confinement. The lawsuit also charges GEO Group of forcing inmates to do janitorial work for free, while at the same time leaving other inmates to starve in squalor, depriving them of food and, of course, necessary medical attention, especially for diabetics. GEO Group, a for-profit corporation, is arguing that because they work for the federal government, their company is immune from prosecution. I don't know whose ass they pulled that one out of. In Newark, New Jersey, at the for-profit prison, Geo Group is being paid $1 billion to revamp. The New York Times is reporting that inmates there are being given stale slices of bread instead of meals. The New Republic reporting inmates complain they are literally starving. The New York Times says attorneys for the detainees, as well as family members, all say due to shortages of beds, inmates there are forced to sleep on the floor. New Jersey Senator Andy Kim, after conducting an on-site investigation, telling the New York Times that construction inside this ICE detention facility is so shoddy, 4 inmates had no problem escaping through its crumbling meshed walls last week. Those 4 inmates were able to escape while living conditions became so extreme, a mini uprising began to take place, so they snuck out as guards refused to quell the disturbance. This, while Department of Homeland Security outside the detention center, outside the prison, they pepper sprayed journalists and protesters. As I said, 4 inmates escaped last week. Police say 2 are now in custody, while the other 2 remain at large. New Jersey Congresswoman LaMonica McIver said after this uprising, quote, "I have serious concerns about the reports of abusive circumstances at the facility. Even now, as we are hearing reports from news organizations and advocates on the ground about a lack of food and basic rights for those inside, the Trump administration appears to be stonewalling efforts to learn the truth." The Black New Jersey Congresswoman was arrested last month and later indicted last week on charges of assaulting a Homeland Security officer while she attempted to conduct an on-site inspection of the ICE facility. Video shows she was pushed into an ICE agent. That ICE agent suffered no injury. Despite ICE's $1 billion shortfall and running out of money in a month, Donald Trump ordered an expansion of his ICE raids beyond those going on right now in Los Angeles, spending money he doesn't have. So unlike that man. The Independent reporting Trump is expanding operations into what he calls the democratically controlled power centers of Chicago and New York. U.S. District Judge Mary Rosado, however, issued a restraining order forbidding ICE from using New York City's Rikers Island to house any of the migrants that ICE rounds up, despite a new agreement made between New York Mayor Eric Adams and border czar Tom Homan. In her ruling, Judge Rosado said she was forbidding Rikers Island from being used by ICE because there's enough evidence to suggest a quid pro quo. A quid pro quo when Mayor Eric Adams signed an executive order to cooperate with ICE. The judge ruled Adams was obviously signing the executive order in exchange for the Trump Justice Department agreeing to end his prosecution after he was indicted, accused of accepting bribes from the government of Turkey and violating campaign finance law. New York, like Los Angeles, is a sanctuary city, so there's always been a question as to whether Mayor Adams' executive order was ever binding in the first place. According to the law, New York City police and other government officials, including teachers, are forbidden from assisting ICE or even so much as asking someone's immigration status. Rikers Island, where ICE was hoping to house the migrants in New York, has been described as a modern-day insane asylum used by New York City police and judges to warehouse homeless people clearly suffering from untreated mental illness. 3 years ago, a New York Times expose revealed guards at Rikers Island forced prisoners to participate in fight night for their own amusement, and the entire place is ruled by gangs. In 2019, the New York City Council voted to close Rikers Island by 2027, but construction of a new jail has yet to begin. There are photos I can show you from exposés done by local reporters here in New York City, but they're too grotesque. I will show you some, but I simply can't show you the really horrific scenes from Rikers Island. Since the law to shut this dungeon down was passed, Rikers has only gotten worse. In 2020, Rikers housed 4,000 inmates. Back then, it was overcrowded and considered a cesspool with 4,000 inmates in 2020. It now houses 6,300 inmates, many of whom are being held there awaiting trial, waiting months, if not years, for their trial. The New York City Comptroller's Office in January of this year issued a report stating, quote, "No one should have to wait 3 years for their day in court in the inhumane and violent conditions of Rikers Island or anywhere else." So far this year alone, 5 Rikers Island inmates have died in custody. But our mayor, Eric Adams, and border czar Tom Homan think the chronically understaffed and overcrowded Rikers Island is the perfect place to begin housing migrant mothers and their children. This is the Mop-Up. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you so much for finding me. Please like this episode and share it with your friends. Shows like this are getting harder to be found. So if you can help me out by sharing this, I would appreciate it. In 1983, then businessman Donald Trump was ordered to pay damages after a judge ruled in favor of plaintiffs who filed a civil lawsuit claiming Trump Tower was built using undocumented Polish immigrants forced to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week without the safety equipment required by law. Now, Forbes magazine reporting that Donald Trump's entire business model is predicated on hiring seasonal migrants. Forbes writes that Mar-a-Lago and Trump's other resorts in the United States have hired close to 2,000 immigrants in the past 25 years to work as waiters, chefs, and gardeners, earning as little as $14 an hour, but no more than $23 an hour. I'm surprised he even pays a livable wage. Forbes writing that work visas provided to these Trump employees do little to protect them from deportation under the president's current policy. Forbes adds the only thing keeping these migrants from getting deported is they work on Trump properties. It's partly why Trump announced over the weekend a drastic change to his deportation policy. Now, immigrants who work in the hotel business, the restaurant business, or in agriculture will no longer be in ICE's crosshairs. Trump has no problem with the sadism behind these roundups. That's the entire point. But he does have a problem with the labor shortage these ICE raids are now creating. A lot of his donors complain that rounding up all the migrants is creating a problem for farmers and as well as people in the hospitality industry. This is why Trump announced the ICE raids will no longer include places of employment like hotels, restaurants, or farms. That also means the people, the donors hiring these undocumented immigrants run absolutely no risk of ever getting arrested, as if they ever did. Trump taking to social media and declaring yesterday, quote, "Our great farmers and people in the hotel and leisure business have been stating that our very aggressive policy on immigration is taking very good, long-time workers away from them, with those jobs being almost impossible to replace." He cannot deport as many migrants as he promised because our entire economy runs on undocumented immigrants. Brooks Rollins, Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, reportedly lobbied hard last week for this reversal after she began receiving nonstop calls from Big Agra, warning that unless these ICE raids stop, they may be forced to start hiring U.S. citizens who would jeopardize our nation's food supply by demanding livable wages and safe working conditions. That's not what they said, but that's why they're doing it, because the last thing Big Agra wants is to hire American citizens because they unionize and they complain when a finger gets chopped off. Donald Trump finally made public his 2024 financial disclosures. It's required by law, and according to the president, he's barely a billionaire. Trump claims right now to have only $1.6 billion in tangible assets. But he did, according to the disclosures, earn $600 million last year while running for president. At the beginning of this year, Bloomberg and Forbes placed Trump's net worth anywhere between $5 and $7 billion, but now Trump is claiming he's only worth $1.6 billion. Why? Well, some say he's lowballing either for tax reasons or in order not to draw attention to some of his more nefarious business deals, including his Truth social media company that continues to lose hundreds of millions of dollars a year and yet has a market cap of close to $5 billion, his cryptocurrency deals, and new multi-billion-dollar real estate ventures with governments like India and Saudi Arabia. He's trying to keep those under wraps. So how did Trump earn $600 million last year? Well, he made $1.3 million from the Lee Greenwood God Bless the USA Bible made in China, $2.5 million from Trump sneakers and fragrances, sneakers and cologne. Yeah, because when I look at Trump, the first thing that comes to mind is, how can I look and smell like that world-class athlete, Donald Trump? $1 million from Trump guitars. That's right, Trump is selling Trump guitars, even though the only thing he knows how to play is the role of a successful businessman. He plays the role of a successful businessman. And his Doral golf course brought in $110 million last year alone. And if you read the health inspector's report for the Doral, you know this means Trump literally has $1 for every cockroach on the premises at the Doral golf course. And of course, Trump Mobile. Variety reporting Trump is now selling the new Trump phone, along with the Trump 5G cell phone service. They're calling it the T1. It's scheduled for release in August, only comes in gold. He claims it's built inside the United States. Sure it is. And customer service will be entirely U.S.-based. Of course it will. Monthly services for the T1 comes to $47.45. $47 because he's the 47th president, and 45 cents because that's how much the phone is actually worth. Or maybe it's because he was also the 45th president. I think that's what they're saying. The new phone was announced by Don Jr. and Eric Trump at a press conference at Trump Tower. Wow. He hired them to sell the phone, to be behind the new Trump phone. I wonder how they got that job. Well, they're obviously the most qualified. Trump Mobile will be regulated by the FCC under the leadership of Brendan Carr, who helped author Project 2025 before becoming head of Trump's FCC. So far this year, our new head of the FCC, Brendan Carr, threatened to punish 60 Minutes for, quote, distorting the news when it edited an interview with then-candidate Kamala Harris to make her look, he claims, smarter than she actually is. No, they didn't have to edit it. You're just stupid, Brendan Carr. Carr, as chair of the FCC, demanded to see the unedited transcripts of that 60 Minutes interview. And even though the transcripts show no favoritism, Carr is now threatening CBS's broadcast licenses and is also threatening to block Paramount, CBS's parent company, from merging with Skydance. Trump is also suing Paramount for $20 billion, claiming the 60 Minutes interview caused irreparable harm to his reputation, as well as financial losses and emotional distress. Trump's nominee to head the Federal Aviation Authority allegedly lied about his qualifications. Shocking. Politico reporting that for decades, Brian Bedford falsely claimed to hold a commercial pilot's license. Bedford has been CEO of Republic Airways for 26 years, and according to Politico, until the reporter from Politico asked about his commercial pilot's license, Republic Airlines' website claimed he had one. Politico reporting that that claim has now been scrubbed from their website. Trump's Department of Transportation calling his claim of a commercial pilot's license an administrative error. Well, you better be careful. Those administrative errors are what got Abrego Garcia shipped off to that dungeon in El Salvador. Bedford insists he has a license to fly privately and that he passed the written and oral exams for a commercial pilot's license, but just never finished the paperwork. Sure. Well, making false claims comes naturally to people in the Trump administration or to Republicans in general. In fact, you can't get hired by Donald Trump unless you're a liar. Tim Scott is the junior Republican senator from South Carolina. He's also chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. You might remember he ran for the Republican presidential nomination last year with the stunningly ambitious slogan, "Vote for Trump." That was literally Tim Scott's campaign slogan, "Vote for Trump." Tim Scott was reported to have been on Trump's shortlist for vice president, but advisors close to Trump said they worried Trump supporters weren't quite ready for a black Republican who's black. So instead, Trump played it safe, and instead of picking a black running mate, he picked a running mate who hates black people, J.D. Vance. As I said, Tim Scott is chairman of the Senate Banking Committee and is now selling one big, beautiful bill the only way it can be sold, by lying about it. And then, when Tim Scott gets called out on his lies, he accuses the people fact-checking his lies of being liars. Right now, the highly respected Congressional Budget Office is warning that this new budget bill would increase our deficit by several $1 trillion, while at the same time throwing 14 million Americans off health insurance. So, what does Tim Scott, the Republican chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, do? He attacks the Congressional Budget Office. By the way, this is nothing new. Trump didn't teach Republicans how to lie. Republicans have been lying about their budgets going all the way back to Ronald Reagan. David Stockman was the director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Ronald Reagan from 1981 to 1985, 1981 being the first year of the Reagan administration. And David Stockman was in charge of Reagan's big budget bill that cut spending on the backs of the poor and middle class, while at the same time cutting taxes for the richest 1%. David Stockman was one of the first Republicans in 1981 to introduce supply-side economics into the conversation, while he and Reagan promised that tax cuts for the rich will balance the budget. It'll create so many jobs, it'll balance the budget. Trickle-down theory, remember that? But the same year that Stockman was lying to the American people and Congress about supply-side economics, that was 1981, he accidentally gave an interview to the Atlantic magazine. It ended up being published in an article entitled The Education of David Stockman. In that article, David Stockman told the reporter from Atlantic magazine that he didn't see how it was possible to give the rich a massive tax cut without ballooning the deficit. I think the reporter, I'm going to say Grider for the Atlantic magazine. Let me know in the comments section. I think it was William Grider who wrote that article. Not sure, but it was definitely in the Atlantic magazine where David Stockman admitted he's full of crap. When that article came out, Reagan was furious and famously said, "I'm taking him to the woodshed." But he didn't fire Stockman. Stockman stuck around to watch Reagan's tax cuts for the rich and the budget deficit soar so high. The budget deficit soared so high, Reagan had to reverse his tax cuts. Yeah, Reagan had to reverse those tax cuts. By the way, Ronald Reagan, whose own son, Ron Jr., 2 years ago said, "My dad was undeniably a racist." Ronald Reagan not only nearly tripled our debt by the time he left office, he ended up, in the end, raising, not lowering, taxes. He also negotiated with terrorists and should have been impeached. Anyway, Glenn Kessler is the fact checker over at the Washington Post. He writes that in a 60-second video attacking the Congressional Budget Office in order to defend Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, Republican Senator Tim Scott, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, made 9 false statements in 60 seconds. That may be a record. 9 false statements in 60 seconds. The fact checker, Glenn Kessler for the Washington Post, calls these false statements. I call Tim Scott an effing liar. So I won't go over all 9 lies. You should read Kessler's piece in the Washington Post. I'll go over a couple. He writes that Tim Scott falsely accuses the Congressional Budget Office of getting Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts all wrong. This is unbelievable. Tim Scott said the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, claimed back then if Trump's tax cuts went through, they would increase the debt and the deficit by trillions of dollars. Tim Scott said, and the CBO was wrong. No, the CBO was correct. The Trump tax cuts in 2017 increased the debt and the deficit by trillions of dollars. It is the same exact lie I busted Steve Scalise on during my last show. By the time Trump left office for the first time, he was responsible, those tax cuts were responsible for nearly 1/3 of our nation's entire debt. The CBO got it completely right. But if you're Tim Scott or Steve Scalise or the entire Republican Party, including Mike Johnson, you can claim with a straight face anything when it comes to numbers. You can claim Donald Trump won the 2020 presidential election. You can claim that. You can claim his tax cuts for the rich didn't result in $8 trillion in debt. Well, the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Tim Scott, also said the Congressional Budget Office was completely wrong about the melon tax cuts of the 1930s. But Kessler over at the Washington Post reports that the Congressional Budget Office wasn't around in the 1930s to score the the Mellon tax cuts. I think the CBO started in 1974, I think. Kessler also points out that the Mellon tax cuts didn't take place in the 1930s. They took place under the Harding administration in the 1920s. Not only that, when Mellon saw the damage from his tax cuts, he reversed them. These are things the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee should know, but as Kessler writes in the Washington Post, Tim Scott has no shame. Just lie. Like your marriage back in August. Remember that when Tim Scott thought he might have a chance of becoming Trump's running mate? He suddenly found a wife and got married in August of last year. Trump didn't pick him as his running mate, but the caterer already got the down payment, so go through with it. More lies, as the White House now claims 250,000 people showed up for draft dodger Donald Trump's military parade in Washington on Saturday. That would be the same Donald Trump who called the men and women in Arlington Cemetery suckers and losers. They're claiming 250,000 people showed up for his parade. Even Elon Musk's artificial intelligence system, Grok, when asked, reports the number is way below 250,000. Most estimates put the crowd size at about half of what the Trump administration is claiming. But Stephen Chung, the White House press spokesman, issued a statement attacking the doubters. He said, quote, 250,000 patriots showed up for our president's parade. Period. Well, apparently Stephen Chung has trouble with crowd and portion size. By the way, Stephen Chung, some sad news for Stephen Chung. He suffered third-degree burns when he attempted to salute the soldiers during the parade while eating his 40th slice of pizza. It was a sad day for Stephen Chung. Here he is trying to salute the soldiers, while eating his 41st slice of pizza. Yes, very sad. That's artificial intelligence, by the way. That's what we can do now with artificial intelligence. We can show Stephen Chung, White House press spokesman, eating pizza. Yep, this is what I do all day. This is him saluting. All right. Meanwhile, First Lady, where am I? Oh, yes, Melania showed up for the big parade, but became increasingly bored. At one moment, she closed her eyes and drifted off, marking the first time in nearly 18 years she slept with Donald. It's estimated that 5 million real patriots turned out Saturday at more than 2,000 events in all 50 states to protest Donald Trump's authoritarian overreach. Reuters reporting that deep red states saw thousands come out in places like Provo, Utah, and Boise, Idaho. 10,000 came out to protest in Salt Lake City, Utah. One person shot to death by two self-described peacekeepers who fired their weapons at another man allegedly brandishing an AR-15. They missed. They hit an innocent bystander. Salt Lake City Police Chief Brian Redd telling reporters the victim, 39-year-old Arthur Falasa Alu, was not the intended target of the two shooters. Salt Lake City police say they're looking into this accidental killing of the innocent bystander shot by one of the two self-described peacekeepers who allegedly attempted to take out this man brandishing an AR-15. Taylor Stevens reporting from Salt Lake City that so far Police have no idea who, if anyone, ever hired these two self-described peacekeepers. Taylor Stevens writing that the term peacekeeper is not a term officially recognized by Salt Lake City Police, and no permits for these armed peacekeepers were ever issued for them to perform security services. I'll be following this story about the good guys with guns showing up, hitting an innocent bystander and killing him. I'm going to be curious as to whether or not these self-described peacekeepers will be facing any charges. In Culpeper, Virginia, one person hit but not injured after a man drove his SUV into a crowd of protesters. The suspect, a 21-year-old white male, was later arrested. In Riverside, California, a woman is reported to be in stable condition after a man drove into a crowd of No Kings protesters on Saturday and then rode off. Meanwhile, the No Kings protests in Minnesota were canceled after State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were shot to death in what authorities now describe as a political assassination. Melissa Hortman, as the former Speaker of the Minnesota House of Representatives, played a key role in the passage of legislation for free school lunches and breakfasts for all Minnesota students all year round. That's her legacy. That's how she'll be remembered. State Senator John Hoffman and his wife were also shot multiple times, allegedly by the same assassin, who was captured and now faces charges of first-degree murder. State Senator John Hoffman and his wife out of surgery. Last time I checked, they are expected to survive. Donald Trump declared his candidacy for president on June 16th, 2015, exactly 10 years ago. Over the past 9 years, death threats against members of Congress have gone from 1,700 in 2016 to more than 9,000 in 2024. Is Donald Trump responsible? Absolutely. 50,000 No Kings demonstrators took to the streets of New York City on Saturday, the mayor of Los Angeles, saying the 30,000 people who marched through her city were overwhelmingly peaceful. She said only 5 arrests had to be made, along with 30 citations. CNN, however, reported some protesters threw bottles and rocks at police. This is The Mop-Up. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you so much for finding me. Please like this episode so I remain in your feed. Leave a comment if I got anything wrong. I issue corrections on this show. And of course, please help me out by sharing this episode. The only reason I have any listeners is because of my listeners sharing these episodes. I'm not part of some podcast conglomerate. Well, poll after poll shows the most popular politician in the United States is Bernie Sanders. That is a fact. The politician with the highest approval rating, according to all polling, is Bernie Sanders. A new survey from Data for Progress showing the most important endorsement for Democratic voters is Bernie Sanders. 60% of primary voters say an endorsement from Bernie makes them more likely to vote for that candidate Bernie's endorsing. Coming in second behind Bernie, Elizabeth Warren, with 56% saying they're more likely to vote for a candidate if Elizabeth Warren has endorsed that candidate. Elizabeth Warren is followed by former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and then Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Walz is followed by New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and then right behind Hakeem Jeffries, New York City Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The Democratic primary for mayor of New York City is next week because New York City is such a deep blue place. Usually, the next mayor is determined in the Democratic primaries, but our current mayor, Eric Adams, is running for re-election as an independent after he kind of was forced to leave the Democratic Party earlier this year when he agreed to assist ICE in rounding up migrants in exchange for the Trump Justice Department dropping those indictments charging the mayor with accepting bribes from the government of Turkey and violating campaign finance law. The disgraced former governor of New York's State, Andrew Cuomo, forced to resign after numerous state employees accused him of sexual harassment and assault, although no criminal charges were filed. Andrew Cuomo, the son of Mario Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo running for the Democratic mayoral nomination next week. He just won an endorsement from former New York City mayor and presidential candidate billionaire Michael Bloomberg. Semaphore reporting Andrew Cuomo is proposing a $10 billion tax increase on corporations and upper-income residents. Politico reporting that Cuomo, despite having a huge machine behind him for next week, is now trailing in a new poll showing him in second place, running 4 points behind this guy, Zohran Mamdani, the 33-year-old New York State Assemblyman who, besides being a Democrat, is also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, just like AOC. AOC, the most, I was going to say she's the most influential New York Democrat, but Hakeem Jeffries is right ahead of her. David Weigel, writing for Semaphore, says Mamdani is running on a platform, get this, and he's leading in the polls. Mamdani is running on a platform to freeze rent, make bus fares free, create a city-funded chain of discount grocery stores. He's also calling for free child care from 6 weeks old to kindergarten, and would make sure child care workers earn what public school teachers get paid. He's also calling for boycotting Israel, insisting it should not be a Jewish state, and that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza should be given the vote. That's going to hurt him in New York. Last week, David Hogg announced he was quitting his Democratic leadership position as vice chair after the Credentials Committee ruled his election was invalid, and they said you have to run again. Earlier this year, Hogg alienated Ken Martin, the chairman of the Democratic Party, when Hogg decided to primary older incumbents who Hogg felt were out of step with most voters. Ken Martin, chairman of the Democratic Party, said to Hogg, it's not your job as vice chair to launch primaries. You're supposed to be neutral. And so the Credentials Committee found a reason to challenge his win. He was told you have to run again for vice chair. And instead of fighting for his job last week, he dropped out of the race. And now Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, announcing she is leaving her leadership post within the Democratic Party to protest its treatment of David Hogg. In her resignation letter, Weingarten accused Democratic leadership of failing to grow the party by not inviting more communities into the big tent. Also quitting his party position this week, Lee Saunders, president of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So, as I just said, the two most influential Democrats are Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Also up there is AOC. Now, Bernie and AOC are self-described socialists, while Elizabeth Warren not a socialist, did invent the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and has made a career out of reining in Wall Street. Also up there, leading the Democrats as the most influential, is Tim Walz, who is governor of Minnesota, along with then Speaker, the late Melissa Hortman, instituted free breakfast, free lunch, all year round for every public school student in the state of Minnesota. See, these are the most influential Democrats who primary voters listen to. So, I don't know about David Hogg. I don't know. I do know before he went to Harvard, he called for the abolition of ICE. He graduated from Harvard 2 years ago, and now he talks in generalities about affordability and the opportunity economy. And yes, he's right, we do need young voices in the party. But until I see David Hogg out there with AOC, Bernie Sanders, Coach Waltz, Elizabeth Warren, and Zohran Mamdani, who could end up becoming New York City's next mayor, not really interested in what David Hogg has to say. Huma Abedin, Hillary Clinton's longtime advisor, she served as deputy chief of staff, while the former First Lady, as well as the former New York senator, served as Secretary of State. Huma Abedin, Hillary Clinton's chief of staff when she was Secretary of State. She was married over the weekend to Alex Soros, son of the 94-year-old Democratic donor and billionaire George Soros. They got married in Watermill, New York. The wedding was attended by Nancy Pelosi, Vogue editor Anna Wintour, Kamala Harris, Kamala's husband, Doug Emhoff, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and of course, the Clintons. You know, as far as the Democratic Party goes, the wedding was a veritable who's who of what's wrong. Huma Abedin's previous husband was registered sex offender and former New York City Congressman Anthony Weiner, who was sentenced to 21 months in prison for texting naked pictures of his Anthony Weiner to a 15-year-old girl living in North Carolina back in 2016. Well, it's been a busy week for out-of-touch elitists who apply Band-Aids in order to distract us from the root causes of poverty and suffering. There was the Soros wedding, and the Bilderberg Group. The Bilderberg Group just wrapped up its 71st annual meeting in Stockholm, Sweden on Sunday, made up of the world's leading business leaders, intellectuals, and politicians. The Bilderberg Group is viewed by many conspiracy theorists as the commanding height of all that is evil in this world. Hey, sometimes conspiracy theorists get things right. In attendance at this year's Bilderberg Group meeting were the usual suspects like the CEOs of Microsoft, the CEO of Pfizer, as well as right-wing donor Peter Thiel, and candidate for governor of Georgia, Harvard's very own Stacey Abrams, as well as representatives from the New York Times, The Economist magazine, and the leader of Sweden's Social Democratic Party. More meetings. Canada playing host to the G7 summit in Alberta, Canada this week. The G7 is comprised of the world's 7 biggest economies, and they meet each year to discuss trade, foreign policy, and pick which new bird flu they think will be the deadliest. They go over the variants to pick the various bird flus and COVID viruses. I'm kidding about that, I think. The Associated Press reporting Donald Trump said yesterday that it might have been a mistake removing Russia from the G7 conference after Putin invaded Crimea back in 2014. The G7 used to be the G8, but then Putin invaded Crimea, it became the G7. The Associated Press reporting Trump is now suggesting that they turn the G7 into the G9 by also adding China to the meeting along with Putin. Trump is a very forgiving man. He said, quote, Putin speaks to me. He doesn't speak to anybody else. He doesn't want to talk to anybody else because he was very insulted when he got thrown out of the G8, as I would be, as you would be, as anybody would be. He's so forgiving of Putin for invading Crimea in 2014, and he's so empathetic. I mean, he's just understands what Putin is going through, not being invited to the G7. He's so empathetic towards people whose money he promised to launder but then kept for himself, and now they're threatening to kill him. I think that's his relationship with Putin, isn't it? So, Trump claiming only he talks to Putin. First off, French President Emmanuel Macron speaks to Putin all the time. He spoke to him in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine and right after. Olaf Scholz, who was Chancellor of Germany until earlier this year, also talked with Putin. Giorgia Meloni communicated with Putin. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, though not part of the G7, is in constant contact with Putin, and so is UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the socialist leader of the UN. They all talk to Putin, Donald. Yes, Putin talked again with Trump over the weekend, and the upshot of that conversation, more war in Ukraine. More war in Ukraine. So maybe not such a great idea, Donald Trump talking with Putin. Well, actually, it's more Putin talking and Trump taking his orders. Trump announced, as I said at the top of the show, he was cutting short his attendance at the G7 summit so he could rush home and handle something. Now, Macron, as I said at the top of the show, Emmanuel Macron said he was rushing back to organize a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. Trump said that's not in the cards. But we do know fighting between Iran and Israel is expected to drag on for weeks. So what is Trump rushing back to Washington, D.C. for? To get in on the airstrikes? Who knows? Who knows? Netanyahu pretty much ignores Trump. So I don't know what Trump is thinking. Trump is taking credit for talking Netanyahu out of killing the Ayatollah. That was Trump's big contribution to world peace. Don't kill the Ayatollah. Brilliant. Talking with ABC News, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said killing the Ayatollah is still on the table. And Netanyahu said he believes killing the Ayatollah would do the exact opposite of inflaming the situation in the Middle East. He said it would tamp down as opposed to inflame the Middle East. And when it comes to inflaming the Middle East, well, Netanyahu is an expert. He is the red hot chili pepper to that sphincter of the world. The Wall Street Journal reporting Iran so devastated by Israeli bombing, they are putting out feelers to negotiate an end to the war. Conventional wisdom, however, if you read the mainstream press, if you read The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, conventional wisdom right now is Netanyahu feels emboldened as Iran's proxy fighters in Lebanon, that would be Hezbollah, Iran's proxy fighters in Gaza, that would be Hamas. They're back on their heels with their entire leadership pretty much eliminated. Don't forget Bashar al-Assad, Iran's ally, the former leader of Syria, has now been overthrown. Israel, according to conventional wisdom, feels the only proxy fighters Iran has left are the Houthis in Yemen, and Netanyahu and his war cabinet believe the current leadership in Tehran, the Ayatollah, is feeling more vulnerable than at any other time since they overthrew the Shah back in 1979. So this morning, Israel is feeling pretty omnipotent. Vladimir Putin reportedly told Trump over the weekend he'd be willing to mediate any peace discussions between Israel and Iran. Yeah. And I'll get my hair tips from Trump. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Iran has been one of Russia's largest suppliers of drones. Lindsey Graham telling Face the Nation Sunday, quote, "If diplomacy is not successful and we are left with the option of force, I would urge President Trump to go all in to make sure that when this operation is over, there's nothing left standing in Iran regarding their nuclear program. If that means providing bombs, then provide bombs. If it means flying with Israel, fly with Israel," unquote. So at the top of the show, I said there are neocons advising Donald Trump. One of those neocons is Lindsey Graham, who back in 2003 was saying real men invade Iran. So there are people who want to be real men, like Lindsey Graham. They've been calling for regime change in Iran for decades, and they now believe it would be a cakewalk. The same way Vietnam was going to be a cakewalk, the same way in 2003 the invasion of Iraq was going to be a cakewalk. Every war, most wars start, especially World War I, with everybody thinking, just be a couple of weeks. It's just going to be a couple of weeks. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and try to tell you what I think Trump is thinking, what his advisors are thinking, and what Netanyahu are thinking. This is what I believe they're thinking, and this is a very dangerous time for America. It's why Senator Tim Kaine, the Democrat from Virginia, wisely introduced legislation saying that Donald Trump cannot assist Israel in its war on Iran without first getting congressional approval. Right? Everybody's saying right now that Iran is ready for regime change. It's never been weaker. I've heard this before. So the neocons and even some America Firsters, not Tucker Carlson, but some America Firsters, believe Iran is completely isolated. They look at the globe, they see Russia, Iran's ally, bogged down in Ukraine, relying on Iran for drones. You'll notice after the attacks on Tehran, Putin kind of condemned Israel, but didn't make any threats. He's in no position to defend Iran, the same way he was in no position to defend Assad in Syria. He's saying, I'll negotiate peace. So there's really nothing Russia can do. They couldn't save Bashar al-Assad other than provide him asylum after he was overthrown. And there was also nothing Iran could do to assist Bashar al-Assad in Syria, even though he was an ally to Iran, especially Iran's proxy fighters in Lebanon, Hezbollah, whose entire leadership has been assassinated, eliminated by Israel. And don't forget, Israel has eliminated much of Iran's leadership. So who is going to come to Iran's help? This is what Trump and Netanyahu and the warmongers are thinking. They're thinking it's safe now to go into Iran because they're isolated. That's what they're thinking. They're thinking Lebanon without Hezbollah having power, Lebanon has no interest in helping Iran. They're thinking Sunni-led Saudi Arabia considers the Shiite-controlled Iran government their mortal enemy. So you'll hear a lot of people calling the Middle East a tinderbox waiting to explode. The fact is, it already has exploded. Trump and Netanyahu and most European leaders don't see anybody coming to Iran's aid. As a matter of fact, most European leaders believe Iran has been the single biggest source of instability in the region because it's funding the Houthis in Yemen and firing missiles at ships trying to head to the Suez Canal. Iran funds Hezbollah in Lebanon. They fund Hamas in Gaza. They funded Assad in Syria, as well as paramilitary groups in Iraq. So many of the world leaders, especially in Europe, would like to see a regime change in Iran. They've done that before, as you know, in the 50s. The G7 just signed a joint statement blaming Iran for having nuclear ambitions. So there's a lot of confidence now about standing up to Iran. Again, they believe there's opportunity, there's opportunity not just for Iran to put away its nuclear program, but to get rid of the Ayatollah. Netanyahu has said to the people of Iran, rise up and overthrow this theocracy. Netanyahu, I don't know if he believes that will ever happen, but I do know that when we invaded Iraq in 2003, Bush and Cheney believed the Iraqis would rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Benjamin Netanyahu keeps waiting for the Palestinians in Gaza to rise up and overthrow Hamas. But bombing campaigns tend to steal the collective mind. And instead of turning on their oppressive leaders, like the Ayatollah, Saddam Hussein, or Hamas, the people tend to rally around the flag and blame the country bombing them, not their own leaders. That's the way it usually goes. Hamas is just as popular today in Gaza as it was before October 7th. The bombing campaign, according to the polling, has made the Palestinians in Gaza more supportive of Hamas and more hateful of Israel. So the West rarely succeeds when it tries to trigger revolutions. Whenever the CIA, whenever the West tries to trigger a revolution, they always end up getting someone just as bad as the person they toppled. So I don't know how this plays out. By the time you hear this, for all we know, Trump is declaring war on Iran. I don't think he's that stupid, but he is stupid. He may be accompanying Israel on these sorties, these raids over Tehran. I don't know what's going to happen. I do know Trump, Netanyahu, and even some Democrats are thinking right now Iran is totally isolated. Putin isn't going to help them. China isn't going to help. Turkey won't help. And don't forget, Iran is not an Arab nation. It's Persian, which means most of the Middle East feels at best indifference towards Iran and at worst hatred and a desire to see its leaders toppled. So this is possibly a dangerous inflection point. The last person who should be inside the Situation Room is Donald Trump, along with J.D. Vance, along with Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth. These are the last people you want feeling that Iran is vulnerable. I don't know how this plays out. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed any of this, please share it with your friends, with your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, your great-great-great-great. Please hit the like button so I remain in your feed. Subscribe to this channel. Subscribe to my newsletter. Thank you to Bob and Mila in the chat room. I'll be doing a lot of shows this week. So thank you for listening. And if I made any mistakes, factually, please correct my issue corrections. And if you disagree with me, I hope the next time we talk, I hope Trump isn't stupid enough to believe we should be assisting Israel over Iran. Those Houthi airstrikes were not successful. Don't let them try to convince you the Houthi airstrikes back in March were successful. They were not.